Hi, friends, it's Rob, and we are fast approaching Lent. Um, I believe we basically say farewell to meat this week, and then Cheese Fair week coming up soon. And that makes me want to think a little bit with you, with C.S. Lewis, about the question of sin, fasting, why it is we do the spiritual practices that we do. And I'd like to approach that through what I think is one of my favorite C.S. Lewis theological texts, anyway. Well, and I think one of my favorite texts of his overall, which is The Great Divorce. It's not necessarily one of his more famous texts, the way Mere Christianity, Screwtape Letters, Narnia are famous, but especially for theological types, Great Divorce is a text that repays repeated readings. If you haven't read it, then part of me wants to tell you to just stop this video, go read it right now, and then come back. Mainly because I think you'll have an incredible time reading it, not necessarily because of anything I'm going to say. But if you have read it, you may remember the premise. It's the genre is what Lewis calls a fantasia, which is a fantasy-like sequence in which the narrator imagines that he has died, and he finds himself in a shadowy realm where things seem very kind of insubstantial. And he decides to get on a bus that goes up into this bright, solid place. And not only does he realize that this bright, solid place is heaven, or at least the sort of valley, the valley of the shadow of life, as one of the angels there puts it. But he realizes that he, in fact, has felt insubstantial because he is insubstantial. The place where he's been is a shadow town. And long story short, the place where he's been is a sort of purgatory, which is on its way to damnation. And one of Lewis's more controversial sort of renderings in this book is this idea that those who are on their way to damnation, even after they've died, have the opportunity prior to the final separation between heaven and hell to leave purgatory, to leave this town that's on its way to hell, and to begin the slow, painful, but joyous journey up to heaven. And you can really think about the influence of Dante here. And the book is powerful because it features a variety of encounters between uh, the residents of heaven, who are very solid compared to the shadowy figures that have emerged on this bus from the shadow place. And they are the ones who are guiding these shadows to what they need to do, what aspects of their life they need to let go of in order to go up the mountain. And the whole book is a series of these encounters between shadow people, those who are not yet saved, but who have the opportunity to be saved, and those who are already more or less in heaven, but have decided to try to tutor, to walk these people up the mountain so that they can continue on the path to salvation. And in these conversations, it becomes very clear what the nature of the sins were that may have sent the shadow people originally to a path to damnation, and that also are holding them back now, and that they need to let go of before they can make their way up the mountain. And if you've read the book, you know that it may be surprising the kinds of things that Lewis identifies as those that are sort of fatal sins and those that are sins that can be overcome by heaven. And what I mean by that is that, and this is something that we see over and over again in Lewis, Lewis is not particularly interested in the ways in which sort of sins of the flesh, gluttony, violence, and so on, he doesn't see those nearly as dangerous in and of themselves. They are dangerous, don't get him or me wrong. But what is particularly dangerous are what we might think of as the more spiritual sins: refusing to let go of anger, refusing to forgive, lack of humility, arrogance in the face of others or in the face of the matters of God. And one encounter is particularly striking, and I think it's one of the most daring encounters in the book, where a mother who has lost a child is has actually been sent to the shadow place, but now has the opportunity to go up the mountain and, in fact, be reunited with her son, which is what she says she wants. However, in order to do that, she has to let go of the bitterness and rage and possessiveness that grief had caused her. And one of the things that Lewis is pointing towards with that is that there is no emotion that we have, there is no bearing that we have, at least in a human sense, that cannot be twisted into an idol. And sometimes it's not even just the things that we know are sins that we have to let go of. Lust, violence, wrath, that sort of thing. It's not even just those that we have to let go of, but it's a certain kind of spiritual bearing towards some of the things that are the best things in our lives, our pride in our achievements, even our love for our family members. Now, Lewis, I think, is quite clear, as is the rest of the Christian tradition, that these things are good gifts of a good God. It's not that love of family, sexual desire, the love for one's children's pride in one's work. It's not that these are bad things, and in fact they are, again, good gifts of a good God. However, as I think we've talked about in this class, for Lewis, as in for so much of the Christian tradition, idolatry is not a situation of us worshiping a bad thing. It's much more often a situation of us taking a good thing and worshiping it as if it were God, or rather holding it closer to ourselves than we hold God's own presence and God's own formation of us. And I think that is a remarkably powerful lesson as we Orthodox, along with many of our other Christian sisters and brothers, are approaching this time of Lenten fasting and discipline in anticipation of Pascha. Because a number of the great Orthodox Church fathers from the early Christian Church on through the present will also tell us that when we fast, it is in fact dangerous to fast if the physical acts of fasting are going to produce a spiritual pride in us. If we're going to not only become prideful, but if we're going to become so focused on the acts of fasting that we forget our orientation and our reason for fasting, which of course is to grow closer to God. And for many of us, certainly I can speak for myself, growing closer to God means in fact shedding myself of some of my own self-centeredness, my own self-regard, even in a spiritual sense. So I think the other powerful aspect of the Great Divorce that is helpful for us to think about as we move into the fast has to do with something that we've already talked about in Lewis, which is that for him, uh, getting closer to God, the process of theosis, the process of moving closer to heaven, is in fact a deeper materiality. In other words, Lewis is not so much in line with those voices in our church tradition that would describe becoming more spiritual as leaving the body behind or leaving the flesh behind. The Rather, for Lewis, if you think about the end of Narnia, if you think about the Great Divorce, if you think about Screwtape Letters, all throughout Weight of Glory, all throughout his canon, there is a sense that because God makes matter, because God makes the body, and matter and the body are good, and God is the source of all goodness, moving closer to God means not only becoming more embodied, but having that which is proper to our body be set aright. And the Great Divorce, and I would actually really recommend it to you maybe as a Lenten reading if you don't have something already. In the Great Divorce, you see these very bodily realities. For instance, just to speak really directly here, human sexuality. There's an episode in the Great Divorce where a shadow soul, is approaching the mountain, the mountain towards heaven. And he's got this little lizard on his shoulder. And the lizard, we don't know exactly what the lizard is whispering to him, but it's clear that the lizard is inciting lust, and a shameful kind of lust. Even the man seems to be ashamed of it. And isn't that how sin is, right? It's Lewis is convinced that, again, sort of our deepest desires, our deepest sense of ourself, we know when it is that our God-given capacities, like human sexuality, are being twisted and manipulated, and it's shameful to us. But anyway, the shadowy figure with the little lizard is approaching the mountain, and a solid person, a sort of angel, if you will, says, okay, you can't bring the lizard in here. Because remember, this is the great divorce, and the divorce in the title is, it's actually a pun on William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And if you know William Blake, you know that he liked to blur the lines between sort of that which is divine, that which is almost transgressive and demonic, and so on, in the name of becoming more human. That was Blake's vision. And Lewis is saying, no, actually, we become more human the more we enact this separation between that which is proper to heaven and that which is proper to hell. Hence the great divorce. And my point is that the angel is saying, look, you think you can bring this lizard with this sort of twisted, lustful thinking into heaven, and you just can't. That which is proper to hell cannot enter heaven. And so the angel says, may I kill the lizard? And something very powerful is in that dialogue, because the man is convinced that if the angel kills the lizard, then the man, in fact, will die. And that's because, and here I think Lewis is right in line with the Christian tradition, including our Orthodox Christian tradition. The man is convinced that somehow he will die if this sinful little lizard dies, because he is mistakenly thinking that sin is constitutive of his identity. And one of the places where you see a correction to that in the Christian tradition actually is in the doctrine of the sinlessness of Christ. Every time I teach the sinlessness of Christ in the seminary, I always have a really good student who asks, doesn't the doctrine of Christ's sinlessness isn't it a kind of docetism, if you know your ancient heresies? Isn't it a kind of making Jesus not really human, a kind of superhuman? And the reason why the student very understandably thinks that is because many of my students, like many of the rest of us, have grown into this way of thinking to say, oh, well, to err is human. Sin and error are somehow constitutive of us as human beings. And the Church Fathers and the Orthodox Christian tradition, by insisting on the sinlessness of Christ alongside the full humanity of Christ, one of the beautiful things that they are insisting with that is to say, no, in fact, not only is sin not constitutive of our humanity, but sin dehumanizes us. Jesus Christ, by being the sinless one, is actually more human than we are. Think about that. Jesus Christ, by virtue of being sinless, is more human, not less than we are. Because I think this is absolutely right. If you think about what sin does to us, to others, it dehumanizes. And so the man thinks that if the angel kills this sin, this lizard, he will die. But he's so tired of it, it's a kind of a beautiful picture of just kind of giving up and giving it all to God. He says, fine, just do it. If it kills me, just do it. I want rid of this. The angel kills the lizard. And here's what's amazing. Here is the genius of Lewis's vision. The lizard, upon dying, transforms into a massive, beautiful stallion horse. And the man turns into a young, vibrant rider. And the rider and the horse ride up into the mountain together. Why am I saying that's so genius? Because, again, Lewis's vision is not, oh, when we become closer to God, we leave what is bodily behind. Rather, this is a picture of redeemed sexuality. This is a picture of human sexuality made right and proper. And when it's made right and proper, it is far more vibrant than it is in its sinful form. This is something that we in our sin don't quite understand. We think that the vibrancy of something like sexuality is found in its sinful, twisted exercise. Lewis says, no, it's when sexuality is set aright in God's light that it actually becomes more vibrant. And that's just one of many examples throughout Lewis's canon, but it's there in the Great Divorce. And why do I bring this up, too, on the eve of our fasting? Of course, in fasting, we discipline our bodies. as well as our minds and our spirits. But the disciplining the body is not because we hate our bodies. It Again, our bodies are good, God-given, created things. Our Lord took on a body in order to save us. As Lewis and our Orthodox tradition will insist over and over again, we hold tight to the Nicene Chalcedonian creeds because we want to preserve the scandal of God having a body, because the body is good. So we discipline our bodies in fasting, not in order to escape the body, not in order to punish the body, not in order to someday escape the body in a kind of Gnostic way. No, we discipline the body because in order to set our bodies aright, to set our bodies' capacities aright, so that we may feast, so that we may feast at Pascha, and we may, by God's grace and God willing, feast with our Lord on that great day. So those are some thoughts on, again, what I believe is this wonderful text, The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. I commend it to you maybe as a Lenten reading. I would love to hear your thoughts if you've read The Great Divorce, and if what I'm saying makes sense, or if you have questions, or if you have pushbacks, put them in the chat. I'm really enjoying those conversations. Also, two other things. One, my heart is breaking, as I know yours is, about the situation in the Ukraine. There's so much to say about the politics, the geopolitics. I don't think this is the place. But I think we can lament not only that any war is tragic, but the prospect of Orthodox sisters and brothers killing other Orthodox sisters and brothers, the fact that it is our Russian Orthodox sisters and brothers with our Ukrainian Orthodox sisters and brothers going to the battlefield against each other, even as Forgiveness Vespers is right around the corner. That's been affecting me this week amidst all the other terrors and uncertainties of this time, and I hope you'll join me in praying that God's wisdom, God's will, and most of all, God's peace be with this situation. The last thing I'll say is that, again, this little course that I'm doing in these discussions, it's being brought to you by St. John the Forerunner, parish in Indianapolis, Indiana. If you're enjoying the content, and if you'd like to make a contribution to St. John the Forerunner, again, the money will go to the parish, not to me, but feel free to prayerfully do that. I do wish you, in these final weeks before these final weeks of preparation for our Lenten journey, and as we prepare our hearts and mind, I wish that God's peace be with you and all of us as well. Blessings, friends.